Good evening, Rowan. It's the 29th of January 2016 and it's just before midnight, and I'm making you my usual Friday evening video to reassure you I won't be seducing any priests over the weekend, so there's no need for you to worry. And you won't be worried either that I'm going to be coming and arresting you, will you? Because you've flown back over the pond again on a long haul flight to go to Florida on a day out. So probably all the ice caps will have melted before you get back, and we'll all have to stand on tiptoe on top of Ben Nevis because of all the carbon dioxide that you've been emitting. Well, on this subject, I thought I could comment just a little bit on the talk that you gave at the launch of Eco Church on the 26th of January, earlier this week at St Paul's Cathedral, and you were really talking about the environment. But that's not what I'm going to comment on this evening. I'm just going to quote a brief thing that you said when you gave this talk, and then I've compiled some video clips at the end of it because I thought it might be helpful for you. But anyway, when I've made this quotation, I'll explain the video clips I've compiled at the end a bit better. So here's what you say. God doesn't just set a lot of billiard balls in a row on a table in front of him when creation begins. God creates that literally, indescribably complex interweaving of forces and energies and presences that is creation. And you can't pull any bit out of it without that little bit disappearing and the whole thing collapsing. So you're talking about billiard balls again, and there was something about billiard balls in the video that I made, Merry Christmas Rowan, where I played a clip of Dr. Judy Wood explaining that the Twin Towers couldn't have collapsed the way that we were told that they did in the 9/11 Commission report, which was the pancake model of the collapse, that one floor crashed down onto another and that they crashed down onto the next one and so on right down to the ground, because that would have taken far too long. It didn't take that long for them to collapse. Anyway, you were somewhat sceptical about this, and you did mention it in an article in the Newstatesman, which I'll quote a bit later on again. So I thought I'd compile some more clips about the collapses of the buildings of the World Trade Center to clarify matters a bit. I thought you'd find that really helpful and you'd be really glad to see those, because your friend Fred Burnham did say he could hear the floors crashing down one onto another, which was impossible because that didn't happen. And he also did say he heard the plane flying over the building and he thought it was going to take the roof off of the building, which is also impossible because there weren't any planes. But even if there had been any planes, since the first alleged plane hit the north side of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, and 74 Trinity Place, where you allegedly were, is to the south of the World Trade Center of the Twin Towers, then he wouldn't have heard a plane going over the roof anyway, even if there had been a plane there in the first place. So that's not possible. But anyway, I'll leave that for now, and I shan't really say any more because I've compiled quite a few clips, but I will be saying some more in another video about this little talk that you gave at the launch of Eco Church on the 26th of January 2016, which was earlier this week. So on that note, I'll wish you a happy weekend, and you'll be able to relax in the knowledge that I won't be arresting you in Florida, won't you? But don't worry, because I know where you're going to be on Monday and Tuesday next week. there's plenty of time for me to be arresting you. So, have a nice weekend then. Hasta el domingo.
Some things are just good to do, because that is how God wants us to live and how God wants us to tread on the earth. The leverage of churches in terms of civil society remains a very serious element in our society, in our culture. That we still have some role in helping to create and to keep going a moral consensus in our society. Let's not underrate that. So there's a very practical reason why churches and other faith communities ought to be involved. There are people around who trust us to do the right thing. People around who expect us to use the presence and the leverage we have in order to bring about change that is for everyone's good. We would call it gospel-shaped change. Not everybody would, but nonetheless, that's the kind of change that people expect us to be part of, more people than we might imagine. We begin to shift the moral consensus that little bit further towards a viable, a just, and a sustainable future. God doesn't just set a lot of billiard balls in a row on a table in front of him when creation begins. God creates that literally, indescribably complex interweaving of forces and energies and presences that is creation. And you can't pull any bit out of it without that little bit disappearing and the whole thing collapsing. We should remember that we are perhaps a bit more significant in keeping moral issues in the public eye than we might think. We should remember that people trust us, often rather surprisingly, to hold the ring for these big issues. We should remember that justice, like faithfulness, is indivisible. That the issues we care about, if we care about the vulnerable and the needy of the earth, are absolutely bound up with the vulnerability of the earth we live in.
He arrives in the lobby of this building, 74 Trinity Place, which is a block and a half south of the World Trade Center. And as we sat on the set watching a television, the second plane went in, and suddenly we knew we were in a war zone. These security people told us to stay put because they did not really know what was going on outside and what might ensue, and so we sat on the set for the next 20 minutes. And then all of a sudden, our building began to shake. There was a huge roar. And as the building collapsed, though we didn't know what was happening, the floor upon floor, it sounded like an explosion. So we all thought that we were being bombed. And in the darkness, because the lights had gone out, all of us hit the floor. When the lights came back on, we were able to identify what had happened. The first tower had collapsed. And so we sat in the room because the security forces here told us to stay put and not to evacuate. We sat in the room watching the television monitor until the first tower came down. And the moment it started to come down, the television blacked out, so we no longer had any visual connection with what was happening down the block. And all we were left with were our own senses. And it began with this sort of dull, low, resonant roar, and it was punctuated by kaboom, kaboom, kaboom as it came down. And
if you had a pancake effect going on, this floor is going to be breaking up, smacking on the next floor, which smacks on the next floor. It wasn't the whole building suddenly going at once. Mm-hmm. But if you have, it's kind of like a relay race. Mm-hmm. But what we saw, when the top floor hits the next one, it turned to dust. Mm-hmm. well, there's not enough energy really from a gravity collapse to turn a building into dust, to turn a floor into dust, but let's assume there was. And then it doesn't have enough energy to break the next floor loose, but let's assume it did.
Yeah.
And so the next one has to start over. It's like it's the next runner for the next quarter mile.
Starting from zero
Right,
speed.
because it's another event beginning again. And how I thought of it that day on 9/11 was, if pretend let's over design the amount of damage to the building. Let's say 9 out of every 10 floors is missing, destroyed, and so the top floor can fall 10 floors before it hits the next one. And then mentally imagine every 10 floors you have somebody standing with a billiard ball in their hand as a timing device. I chose billiard balls because they're all like standard issue, but just a different color so you can separate one from the other. And this person can't let go of their billiard ball until they see the one above pass by. So the blue one is dropped, the person holding the red one sees the blue one go by or has an electric eye that releases it and lets that one go. And then the yellow ball 10 floors down gets let go when the red one goes by. And just going through that quick exercise, that's 31 seconds. 3 times what the free fall time would be.
So it would probably be over a minute of seismic activity.
At least.
At least.
Because the Kingdom's free fall drop time is like 4 seconds.
Right.
And it was 52 seconds. You had this,
Right. So, and the seismic trace was 8 seconds in
for the North
duration
Tower
in total. So that's proof that it cannot have been a controlled demolition or indeed the pancake theory.
So now you're having a snipe about my Merry Christmas Rowan video because you're trying to squirm out of the fact that you weren't in Manhattan on 9/11 and you're actually a perception manager for the New World Order. So you tell this heartrending story of how you thought the Twin Towers were going to land on top of you and that was the end of you and you had to wear a gas mask and run off and heroically rescue some tiny children and all that kind of thing. And so we're supposed to be drawn into the details of this story and empathise with you and feel horrified and sad and upset and relieved and all these kind of things. You're playing on our emotions so that we don't spend any time figuring out that the whole story itself is a heap of garbage. So you're a perception manager. This is what you have to say anyway in this article, which is allegedly a book review. So you say, any sort of action at a distance, above all the phenomena of magnetism, required an explanatory scheme rather more capacious than a billiard ball materialism, causality as a world of things bumping into each other, which is why, a nice irony, Newtonian gravity was written off by serious scientific contemporaries as yet another form of magical speculation. So this reference to billiard balls is a reference to the clip from Dr. Judy Wood that I played in your Christmas greeting video, where she explained using a billiard ball as a symbol, really, how long it should have taken the Twin Towers to collapse and how long the seismic register should have been. And the fact is that it simply can't have happened in the way that the 9/11 Commission report said that it did. By floors pancaking one down onto another and eventually all crashing to the ground. It can't have happened like that because it would have taken much, much longer and there would have been a far greater seismic register had it happened that way. And that way of the building collapsing was completely impossible anyway, but even if it could have collapsed that way it would have taken far, far longer. And another thing that she didn't mention on that video, but which is another factor which proves that this model of the collapse is completely impossible, is that the foundations of the Twin Towers went down a phenomenally long way, and they were built right at the side of the Hudson River, and because of that they had to be placed in something that they called the bathtub to stop the Hudson River flooding into the foundations. And had the buildings collapsed in the way that was described in the 9/11 Commission report, the weight of all that material crashing to the ground would have smashed this bathtub, and it would have caused the Hudson River to flood the New York subway system. And since that didn't happen, the buildings cannot possibly have collapsed in the way that we were told they did. So I only put some little video clips in that Merry Christmas Rowan video, but I've done a phenomenal amount of research, particularly around the stories that you and people associated with you have told, and I know that you're lying, and I only put a smidgen of it in that video.
The two of you, when you were a leader at Chase Manhattan and he was governor, were responsible for really the World Trade Center.
We worked together on that.
Lower Manhattan was deteriorating, and a radical plan for its revitalization was championed by David Rockefeller and his brother Nelson, then governor of New York. With Mayor John Lindsay on board, they set out to build a trade center, the likes of which the world had never seen, and on a shocking scale. 2 110-story towers.
Here is David today. David is proud of being part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States. He brags about this on page 405 of his 2002 autobiography entitled Memoirs. He was also quoted prior to 9/11 as saying, "We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis. And the nations will accept the New World Order." If you know anything about the New World Order, you'll understand why this is a big problem for a huge percentage of the people on this planet. Since they became obscenely wealthy back in the 1800s, David's family has been using their immense, ill-gotten fortune to take over literally every aspect of our lives as Americans. Our education and medical systems, our economy, and our media. These people love war, murder, corruption, oppression, and, if the right major crisis does not occur, they'll create it to further their agenda.
(9:59), New York City, New York. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses to the ground in approximately 10 seconds. 29 minutes later, the North Tower follows suit, collapsing in approximately 10 seconds. Later that evening at 5:20, World Trade Center 7, a 47-story office building 300 feet away from the North Tower, suddenly collapses. The building's tenants included the CIA, Department of Defense, IRS, Secret Service, and Rudy Giuliani's emergency bunker. And the SEC was using it to store 3,000 to 4,000 files related to numerous Wall Street investigations. Although every single building surrounding Building 7 stood intact, it fell straight down into a convenient little pile in 6 seconds. Official explanation? Falling debris from the Twin Towers created an internal fire, which ignited several fuel tanks inside the building. If this is true, then it would be the third building in history to collapse because of a fire. The first two would be the Twin Towers. On July 28, 1945, a B-52 bomber lost in the fog crashed into the 79th floor of the Empire State Building. 14 people dead, $1 million in damage, but the building stands intact to this day. On February 14, 1975, a 3-alarm fire broke out between the 9th and 14th floors of the North Tower. According to the New York Times, the fire leads to intense scrutiny of the towers and eventually to a decision to install sprinklers. On May 4, 1988, a 62-story skyscraper in Los Angeles burned for 3 hours and spread over 4 floors. It did not collapse. On February 23, 1991, a 38-story skyscraper in Philadelphia, built in 1973, burned for more than 19 hours and spread over 8 floors. It did not collapse. On October 17, 2004, a 56-story skyscraper in Venezuela, built in 1976, burned for over 17 hours and spread over 26 floors, eventually reaching the roof. Guess what? It did not collapse. On February 12, 2005, the Windsor Building in Madrid, a 32-story tower framed in steel-reinforced concrete, burned for almost 24 hours, completely eradicating the upper 10 stories of the building. Although the top 10 floors of the building fell, the building itself did not collapse. And yet, on September 11, 2001, two 110-story skyscrapers, completed in 1973, burned for 56 and 103 minutes, respectively, over 4 floors, before collapsing completely to the ground. One might argue that this was due to the construction of the World Trade Center. Let's look at what was inside those buildings. The Twin Towers were composed of 200,000 tons of steel, 425,000 cubic yards of concrete, 103 elevators, 43,600 windows, 60,000 tons of cooling equipment, and a 360-foot television antenna. The core of each tower was 87 by 133 feet, comprised of 47 box columns 36 by 16 inches thick. The North Tower was completed in 1970, standing at 1,368 feet tall, and the South Tower was completed in 1973, clocking in at 1,362 feet tall, making them the tallest buildings in the world until the Sears Tower was completed in 1974. Galileo's law of falling bodies calculates the time in which an object will travel a certain distance in complete freefall. Distance, d, equals 16.8 times time in seconds squared. The South Tower was 1,362 feet tall. 1362 equals 16.08 times 84.7, or 9.2 seconds. The Twin Towers came down in nearly free-fall speed. 200,000 tons of steel shatters into sections no longer than a couple feet long. 425,000 cubic yards of concrete is pulverized into dust.
That's the part that's crazy. It's just that's all that's left.
People who have been right down next to the base of what was the trade towers say there's virtually nothing left. Maybe a few flights of stairs, a few stories of one of the buildings.
110 stories at ground level. 110 stories at ground level.
I've got a picture of Building 7 in the background still standing and fuming away. It went away at 5:20 that day. So we know it's before 5:20 on 9/11. You're looking straight over from West Street, and you should see a 110-story building blocking your view. But there's just nothing there, right down to the ground. They didn't burn up, nor did they slam to the ground, but turned into dust in midair.
Although they were demolished in such a way as to look as if they fell, they did not fall at all.
The buildings, in fact, mostly turned to dust before they hit the ground.
You see the steel falling in midair, trailing dust. It's not hitting anything as it's flying through the air. So why is it turned to powder in midair? It's not pulverization, it's not vaporization. I call it dustification. The buildings turn to dust.
Those towers literally disintegrated. They went into dust.
How could so much steel and concrete just vaporize? Did it all turn to dust?
It's incomprehensible for somebody to see something solid turn into dust.
The buildings turn to dust in midair. If you look at it, you can see that.
This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back.
You have a steel beam flying through the air, and it's dissolving as it flies through the air. It's turning into dust, and it's not hitting anything. The building was not smashed to bits. So that's why pulverizing doesn't describe it.
No explosions, no heat, no flames.
Vaporization implies high heat. If you would have seen the whole building glowing, people would have been blinded by the light. It's very dense dust. It initially blocked out all of the sunlight, 100% of the sunlight, so it was pitch black. You come to the realization that these pieces of material are becoming dust. They're frothing up into dust as they fall.
And if you watch some of these pieces, you can actually see them turning to dust before they hit the ground.
It turns to dust.
That's amazing. That is amazing. I mean, just like a Star Trek thing. It just, poof, it's gone.
What we saw and what happened on 9/11 was something that we as the public had never seen before.
What happened on 9/11, I believe today it was not a controlled demolition, it was not nanothermite, and it certainly was not the pancake effect of two planes hitting a building.
There's a cluster of core columns that remains here. Watch what happens to them. They just faint. Here's Building 7, which is a 47-story building. It's like 650 feet tall, approximately. This has got to be over that.
It physically disintegrates in front of your eyes. Not concrete, but steel.
You can see all of this just frothing up into dust. And it's also blowing downward. That's about 700 feet tall. If that thing tipped over, it would take out a few blocks worth of buildings. How's it going to go straight down? You got a 700-foot hole in the ground, dropping into?
The buildings turn to dust before they even reach the ground. You can actually see this happening. You can watch any of the videos from the news channels. They all show the same thing.
We thought we knew what we saw.
A plane hitting the building should not turn the buildings into dust.
The Twin Towers had collapsed. Now, unlike most conventional skyscrapers, which have lots of interior columns to give strength to the building, the exterior walls of the World Trade Center bore most of the load, so the direct attacks were enough to weaken the buildings and lead to their collapse.
Because the emergency office of the City of New York was in Building 7 that burned down that day.
Well, South Manhattan down here just behind me. As you can see behind me, it's awful.
The Salomon Brothers building in New York has also collapsed.
I need to take a break. Do you have any idea whether or not other buildings in the immediate area are vulnerable at the moment, whether there's concern about any other building as there was about this additional one after the towers?
Well, from the angle I'm looking at, we can see one other building still on fire.
We found some masks because there was smoke beginning to come into the building, and most of us strapped these on, made our way down to see if we could get out of the building.
There's different kinds of masks and filters, basically, depending on the hazard that you're working with. So what I'm asking you is, what hazard was there in an office building in the New York financial district that necessitated such a large number of respirators on the premises that you, the majority of you said, which the number of people that you're talking about at that moment in time is at least 23 people. So what was it in this office building in the financial district of New York that necessitated enough respirators that the majority of 23 people could find them and strap them on? What was going on? I mean, providing respirators for office workers is about as absurd as providing oven gloves for office workers. You know, you provide oven gloves for people who work in kitchens and take things out of ovens, and you provide respirators for people who would be breathing in harmful substances such as solvents, dust, fume, for people who are welding, and for people who are working in environments where there may be a low level of oxygen, such as in storage tanks, but they'd really need breathing apparatus then. So what was going on then in this office that needed respirators? And what kind of respirator did you put on? Actually, I've got some pictures here, so you can have a look at it and decide which respirator it was that you were wearing. So here we are, we've got some respirators here, look. This is the PDF from the Health and Safety Executive website. So there you are, these are powered ones at the end here, look. Probably didn't mean those. So which one were you wearing then? And as you notice as well, it tells you here that there's a continuous wear time limit as well. So how long were you wearing it for as well, before you needed to throw away the mask if it was a disposable one, or change the filter if it wasn't? So you shot yourself in the foot again, haven't you? Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about personal protective equipment. Oh, I just want to say as well that these kind of things are actually very expensive, so the likelihood of any business shelling out for personal protective equipment such as respirators, respiratory protective equipment, or any other thing, you know, would a business buy a pair of oven gloves for all its office workers? Well, no, they wouldn't, and that would be much cheaper. So it's just completely ridiculous to suggest that they would be buying masks to store in an office building. It's just ridiculous. And I'm aware that health and safety regulations will be different in the US to what they are here, but nevertheless, smoke and fumes and dust and particles and vapours and all those kind of things, the hazards aren't any different, and the fact that businesses don't want to spend money they don't have to, that isn't different either.
There are people around who trust us to do the right thing. People around who expect us to use the presence and the leverage we have in order to bring about change that is for everyone's good. We would call it gospel-shaped change. Not everybody would, but nonetheless, that's the kind of change that people expect us to be part of, more people than we might imagine. We should remember that we are perhaps a bit more significant in keeping moral issues in the public eye than we might think. We should remember that people trust us, often rather surprisingly, to hold the ring for these big issues.
Acting is a very emotionally vulnerable sport, and you have to get up and do it in front of an audience.
But basically tell a story with your body and your voice.
Part of our program is teaching actors skills to work on camera.
You trust me in what I say. The government love you. The government cares for you. Watch the television. This is the truth. Criminals and terrorists want to kill you. The government will save you. The police will save you. We need to go to war to protect you. We are here to look after you. Conspiracy theorists are insane and dangerous. Be fearful. We're small and weak. The government is strong. We will look after you. Obey. You must obey. You feel sleepy and relaxed. So relaxed. This is the truth. The truth. The truth. You are fearful. Fearful. You do not like music. You do not like people who smoke. You do not like people who try to tell you things that are bad about your government. These people are dangerous. They are not to be trusted. Listen and obey.
Listen and obey.
The New World Order.
The New World Order.
Welcome to the New World Order.
Viva ce New World Order.
Welcome to the New World Order.